Thank you, Your Honor. I called Kevin Lucas.
All right, Mr. Lucas, due to the passage of time, I'm going to swear you in again. Can you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
All right, go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Mr. Lucas, could you just tell us again who you are and where you work?
Sure. Kevin Lucas, working with the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA.
I believe we have a new court reporter. Do you mind spelling your last name?
Yes, its full name is Kevin, Kevin, Lucas, Lucas.
Okay. And obviously, you're the same Kevin Lucas that testified on behalf of AriSEIA last week, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Uh, Before we get started, and for the purposes of the record, the point of this is to address some AriSEIA exhibits and also to respond to Mr. Elliott's testimony since he went after us. Before we get going, let's just talk about some of the AriSEIA exhibits. Could you tell me what AriSEIA 25 is?
Sure. AriSEIA 25 is two data responses and one spreadsheet associated with the data response. This is related to the discussion of the peak and off-peak energy values that Mr. Elliott included in his analysis, and also related to how the company incorporates capacity-related charges in its time of use rates. So the first one, AriSEIA 1104, it's one page with the explanation requesting the variable energy costs, and then 4 pages, one of which is blank, of a spreadsheet that contains that data. And then AriSEIA 12.2 is talking about how demand-related costs are incorporated into a volumetric rate that doesn't have a demand charge, and the response is confirming that the company puts those in the tiered portion of the energy charge, not in the time of use portion.
Okay, and just for the purpose of the record, is that 12.02?
Correct. 12.02 is the second one.
Okay, and then what is AriSEIA 23?
AriSEIA 23 is another Discover response. This is AriSEIA 1301, and it's a fairly long discovery that was inquiring about sort of the nature of retail prices, how they're supposed to work. It was a follow-up on a number of different questions talking about demand rates, how the company performs its analysis, and the like. And so it was covering issues about the company's modeled avoided costs, their ranges, again, similar to what Mr. Elliott had testified in terms of the differential, talking about the way that customers who save money on different rates are able to respond or are not responding, and so on. So it's a collection of discussions back and forth about the demand charges, their structure, and how customers behave on them.
Okay, and before we move on, Your Honor, is he cutting out for you or is that just me?
Just you, Ms. Johnson.
Okay. Might be a bandwidth issue. If that continues, I might turn off my video, just an FYI. Okay, did you hear the verbal testimony of Mr. Elliott last week?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Do you have anything that you'd like to add in response to his verbal testimony?
I do have a few things. There's a couple differences that we have that I think are fairly clear in our discussions and our testimony to date, but I think there was a few specific points that Mr. Elliott brought up that I felt merited some additional comment. One of the main challenges that we're trying to deal with respect to the demand rate is how well customers can manage their bill. And Mr. Elliott has testified both in his written testimony as well as on the stand that basically rules of thumb or rubrics or customers generally knowing how much energy their appliances use was sufficient for customers to be able to manage on a demand charge. I remember reading this in his direct testimony. I think he responded some to one of my arguments as well in his rebuttal. And I actually walked through an example of why this is not the case in my surrebuttal testimony. So in my surrebuttal testimony, one of my many open files at the moment, here we are. This is Sir Rebuttal testimony is, Ms. Johnson, you're going to have to help me with the exhibit number. I don't know what we call this
AriSEIA
as.
2.
AriSEIA 2, thank you. On page 13 through 16, and I'm not going to go over the full example, but basically starting on page 14 of the testimony, which is Bates number 19, I talk about this exact interaction and why generic rules of thumb are not sufficient to actually manage your demand on a demand charge. As we know, the way a demand charge works is it takes the highest hour of demand during the peak period through the course of a month. And whatever that highest number is, that's going to set your demand charge, for which the customer pays a fairly sizable dollar per kilowatt hour rate. So knowing how much your different appliances use is only part of the discussion. And I walk through a detailed example of a customer who maybe they've been using, their air conditioning up to that month. They've been, running their household as they normally do in the summer. And they have a peak load up to that point of the month at 5 kilowatts. But for whatever reason, they now find themselves needing to do some laundry in the middle of the afternoon in order to get ready for something. Their air conditioning is still running because it still is the middle of the summer. But when they run their electric dryer, which can pull up to an additional 5 kilowatts, if they ran a load of laundry where their peak demand went from 5 kilowatts to 10 kilowatts, they would incur a sizable incremental bill based on that 1 hour of usage. I think I calculated it to be $62 just for running that one load of laundry. Now, whether a customer knows exactly how much their dryer is using or not, whether they have avoided using their dryer during the peak time every other peak hour in that month, unless they do something active to offset that demand from their dryer, they're going to see their demand charge increase for that month. And once they set that, there's nothing that they can do to control it. So that is an incremental cost that is massive for using a dryer for 1 hour. So knowing how much your dryer uses, generally trying to avoid them is not sufficient because the demand charge is very punitive in that sense. The minute that you increase it beyond where you had to that point in the month, you're going to incur a large increase in your bill that you simply can no longer avoid. Contrast that with the time of use rate, where you have an ongoing price signal to minimize your usage during the peak, but you don't have this massive $62 punitive issue for having to do laundry in an afternoon, because sometimes you just have to run your house. You have to do things at the household level that could cause your demand to increase. So, Mr. Elliott's notion that broadly knowing you shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that or try to avoid it, it runs afoul with how houses actually work, and it doesn't recognize the extremely punitive nature of a demand charge. One other area that I thought was a little bit interesting as well is in the back and forth, I think, with Ms. Johnson is, Mr. Elliott said that time of use rates were not designed to save money for the company. And I sort of perked my head a little bit at that because in my view of time of use rates, they are explicitly designed to reduce costs, but maybe on a different time frame than what Mr. Elliott continues to talk about. And I think this, again, is an important distinction between our positions. Mr. Elliott is focused on recovering historical costs that the utility has already incurred. And what I'm thinking about when I think about price signals and I think about customer response and behavior, it's about sending the price signal to modify behavior so those costs in the future are different. I went back and I looked at the company's application, and I think they said they have increased their rate base by something like $750 million since the last rate case. Well, if there had been price signals for customers so that their demand would have been less, then when they came in for this rate case, that $750 million might have been something lower. And if time of use rates are established here that help shift load in the future, then the next time the company comes in for a rate case, all else equal, the requests that they have may be lower in the future. So time of use rates and price signals generally are not just about recovering historic costs. They're about sending a message to customers so that you can help manage and maintain those forward-looking costs as well. That's critically important because over time, all else equal, costs have continued to go up. And this is one tool that can help manage that. I referenced in the early part of this about the one demand rates being included in the inclining block structure per the discovery response. I think Mr. Elliott may have at one point in his testimony indicated that some portion were collected in the volumetric time of use peaks, but I think their discovery response shows that it's actually not in the time of use components, and it's in the tiered rate component. He may have clarified that later in some additional discovery, but just to be concrete, per the company's discovery response, those demand-related charges are currently collected in the tiered rate component, not the time of use component. And once again,
And
speaking.
which discovery response is that? Could you specify, please?
Yeah, sorry, it was 12.02, which I think was exhibit
25.
25. Thank you. So that discovery confirms that they're in the tiered rate, which again is not sending a price signal, since those demand-related costs are caused by peak demand. Then sending a price signal to reduce usage during those peak aligned times is a way to send a price signal for customers to reduce that on a go-forward basis. So the reason that my price differential is so much larger than his is it's not only recovering the difference in energy costs, it is recovering a portion of that capacity cost, because those are the prices that will cause the behavior changes so that those demand-related costs in the future can be lower. And then briefly, just to walk through the example, and it's always dangerous going into a PDF of a spreadsheet, but I did want to quickly run through exhibit. These things move around. Where's my spreadsheet? Here
Are
we
you
are.
looking for 11.04?
Yes, 11.04. So this is AriSEIA 25, and it's the spreadsheet on this. This is the, turning to the page 1 of 4 of the spreadsheet. The title of the spread is AriSEIA 1104, Average Lambda 2025 TOU Analysis. This is the first of 2 pages that contains the hourly summary by month for the company's system lambda, which is basically the marginal cost of their generators. 2 things I wanted to point out on this on page 1 and 2. First is that the system lambda is not, it may be the marginal cost of the company's resources, but it's not the marginal cost of energy that they're actually using to meet their demand at that point in time. So Mr. Elliott is, if he was basing his numbers on strictly the system cost of their own generating fleet, he's overlooking the data that's on page 3 of the same exhibit. So if you scroll down to page 3, here you can see the purchases that the company is making. The top is based on real-time purchases, and the bottom is based on total purchases, including real-time. And 2 things to note, if you compare the relative costs of the purchases and the system lambda, is first, the costs of the purchases are substantially higher. And in fact, in the summertime, you can see there, looking at the real-time purchases in July, the column that says average purchase total, which is equal to basically the dollars of purchases divided by the megawatts of purchases, is $127 a megawatt hour. That's basically 3 times the variable cost that the company is claiming that its own fleet is able to do. And I'm sorry, 4 times the cost that it is actually using to generate its own energy. But the reason that the company is purchasing energy in the wholesale market is because it needs to. It's not choosing to spend $127 per megawatt hour just because. It's doing that because it needs to buy additional resources in order to meet its peak load during those summer months. The bottom set of numbers here is the total purchases, including real time. And you can see here, the first column, megawatt purchased, is much, much larger. I did some math on these, and in the winter months, the company is buying between 300 and 400 megawatt hours every hour. So basically 300 to 400 megawatts is included in this schedule every hour of the month in this. In the summertime, that number goes up between 500 and 700 megawatts. So the company is buying substantial amounts of power, either from the wholesale market or through different mechanisms that they're not their own generation. And as you can see, once again, in the average purchase total, they are doing that at costs that are substantially higher than their own system lambda. Now, this data here, unfortunately, does not show the hourly breakdown. We did ask the company to provide this information on an hourly basis, and the company said it was not able to. So had I had this information, I would have done some additional analysis. And based on the work I've done in the APS case, I can tell you that it is almost certainly that the afternoon peak hours in the summer are substantially higher than the midday hours in the summer. And so the differential between these prices is much larger than what the company is representing just by using its system lambda. I think that's all I have on the Mr. Elliott comments.
Okay, did you want to walk through anything in regards to his recross with Kroger?
Yeah, in regards to his recross with Kroger, they went back through the hypothetical example that Ms. Johnson, you walked through with Mr. Elliott, and if folks remember, this was the customer who set their 300 kilowatt peak on the first day of the month, and the question was, what type of price signals do rates send to manage their behavior past that? And I believe in the back and forth with Kroger's attorney, they got to a point where Mr. Elliott basically said that because there are some demand-related costs that are recovered in the volumetric dollar per kilowatt hour energy rate, that if anything, the company is under collecting its demand-based costs and over collecting its energy costs. One important assumption is embedded in this statement that I don't think is clear. And it's the assumption that the peak of the individual customer matches up with the peak of the overall system. And this is not the case. It's not the case all the time in the summer months. It absolutely is not the case in the winter and the shoulder months. And so an individual customer may have the peak even in a summer month, let's say on the first or second of the month. But that may not be the highest load of the overall system, just because that customer hits their individual peak in that hour. What matters is the customer's contribution during the 4CP hours in terms of their responsibility for the cost allocation process. And if their load in those hours that are used for cost allocation are lower, they're not getting any credit for that on their billing demand, because their billing demand is based on their individual peak in that month. And this is absolutely true for the spring and the fall and the winter, because in the spring and the fall and the winter, the company's peak loads are substantially lower, which means that the capacity is not being stressed, which means an individual customer's peak demand in March has nothing to do with their contribution to the overall capacity costs of the system. And yet that customer is still paying a sizable demand charge based on their individual customer peak demand. So when Mr. Elliott is saying that they may be over-recovering or under-recovering their demand costs, he's making an assumption that there's perfect alignment between that individual customer's demand and the demands on the system that drive the total costs. And that is not the case. It's absolutely not the case for at least 9 months of the year. And it almost certainly is not the case for the 3 summer months when the system might actually be facing its higher levels.
Mr. Elliott also had some back and forth with the judge. Did anything come up within that conversation that you wanted to respond to?
Yeah, a couple things on this, and one was, again, related to how time of use rates could be designed and whether they impact other customer groups. I believe Mr. Elliott said that in the short term, he agreed that you could do revenue neutral rates that would not affect other groups, but in the long term, that they would start to spill over and any loss of revenue would need to be recovered from other classes over time. So I think it's important to note the context of this. The answer to this question is going to depend if the ARAM is adopted. Now, I haven't done any analysis. I haven't done any testimony on the ARAM. I did read through the proposals and have a general understanding of what the company is looking for in that. The ARAM would function as sort of a revenue decoupling mechanism, where the amount of revenue that an individual class comes in will be compared to the revenue requirement that the company would earn based on its updated capital and other expenses. And this would adjust on an annual basis to basically reduce the lag between when a company incurs a cost and when they get to recover that in rates. But there are many adjustments that are going to be going into that calculation. There's no assurance that any revenue change from time of use rates are going to come out in that mix one way or the other. Likewise, if the company is over-earning, meaning that they're past the high-end deadband of the ARAM mechanism, then any revenue reduction is not going to be recoverable in any event. They're already earning too much, which means a reduction from 25 basis points over to 23 basis points over, based on the original deadband, would not have any ability to collect the revenue. So I think it's not the case that this will, in all instances, result in a long run change over time. If the ARAM is not adopted, however, just based on the standard approach of utility, rate making and the timing of rate cases, it's very important to note that revenue reductions for the utility is not the same thing as a cost shift. It's a revenue reduction for the utility. It means that they may earn fewer profits, but the commission is not obligated to provide a guaranteed rate of return to the utility. The commission is required to provide rates that provide the opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return. But there are any number of reasons why the company's actual revenue and their actual return on equity may be higher or lower than what their target is. It could have to do with particularly mild weather or particularly hot weather. It could have to do with customers that join the company faster, or changes in forecast that were not anticipated. So there's any number of ways that revenues and the revenue from an individual class may or may not match up with there. But if the company has a reduction in revenue, that is not a cost shift per se, because the company would simply experience lower revenues. And of course, the next time they come in for the rate case, they'll go back and they'll look at the test year under a standard approach, and they'll reset the rates as necessary. But in between those rate cases, it's not like any reduction from the time of use rates would automatically be cast into another class. One thing to quickly clarify, and I think Ms. Johnson mostly got there, but I did not propose that our time of use rates would be an opt-out approach. I think eventually the discussion about looking at the commission and making reference to the fact that commission was not ready to adopt that, despite other states having done that, may have been the source of the confusion. But I will clarify that AriSEIA is not proposing that the time of use rates be an opt-out provision. They would remain voluntary, they would remain opt-in, and customers would have the ability to choose to participate them. The last piece here that I did want to discuss is in the back and forth about the price signals that demand charges send compared to time of use charges. And I believe Mr. Elliott said that demand rates would provide a larger incentive to see bill savings. I think what he's basing that on is that if you're able to reduce your peak demand by 1 kilowatt, you would save a larger amount of money than if you were able to reduce your energy by 1 kilowatt hour. That is correct, but the problem is the ability to actually manage your demand consistently throughout every single peak period of all the days in the month. As I walk through with that example of the laundry, one slip up for 1 hour is going to reset your demand. And it can not only erase any savings that you might have gotten on that rate, it can actually cost you substantial amounts of extra dollars. So the time of use rate continues to send those price signals, but in a much more forgiving way from the customer's perspective.
Okay, well, I think that's a good point to start talking about what AriSEIA 24 is and how it's different than AriSEIA 22.
Sure. So AriSEIA 24 is the updated analysis. As I believe you guys covered on Friday before I joined the call, the company had initially sent over the wrong set of data that had demand charges for customers that were not reflective of their billing demand. An updated data set was sent on Friday, and I spent some time going through that updated set, largely duplicating but also expanding some of the points of my analysis. And the top line number of customers who are poorly served on this rate did go down some. So under the original data set, I think it was 78% of customers would be better served on the time of use rate. In the updated data set, that's come down to 52%. Still, that's over half the customers who are on this rate are being poorly served by this and would be able to save money if they are on the time of use rate. And these are customers who have chosen to take service on the demand rate. On average, these customers are overpaying by 21%, or about $215 per year. And I went back and I looked at the total data set for the test year, and the company is averaging $95,000 in extra collections per month from these customers. So that's an annualized rate of $1.13 million just from this subset of customers who have chosen to be on a demand rate who were not being well served. Now, in the actual test year, not all of those customers were on the tariff for 12 months. So the actual amount of money that the company collected was about $606,000. Importantly, a sizable portion of that $606,000 came on customers who were on the demand charge for the entire year, despite the fact that this demand charge is poorly suited for their usage patterns. $344,000 extra was collected from customers who were on this rate the entire year, despite it being a bad fit. Now, there is a lot of customer churn on this rate, which means that satisfaction is probably not that high. In the data set, there were hundreds of customers who would sign up for the rate and then drop it 1 or 2 months later, presumably because they were doing a bill comparison and realized that they were not saving money, so they switched to a different rate. Only a fraction of the people who were on this rate stayed on it for the entire year, and a good size of those customers, as I mentioned, actually lost money the entire year. For one reason or another, they didn't either analyze their bill or didn't go back and revisit the comparison, but they stayed on a tariff where they were costing self money throughout the entire year. The analysis does update a number of the charts and the graphs. I did want to point to one that I think enhances the discussion about whether or not these demand charges are actually providing actionable price signals. And if you look on Bates page 12 of the testimony, this is some additional analysis that I did looking at the new load factors and the distribution of the load factor. So this is a little bit of a confusing chart, but I'll walk through what it is. This is a histogram showing customers who are best served on the time of use rate in blue and customers who are best served on the demand time of use rate in orange. And it's basically a stack chart showing for every combination of customer and bill, so these are monthly customer bills, what the load factor in that month was. And so as you recall, the load factor is the ratio of energy that a customer used compared to how much energy they would use if they sustain their peak demand for the entire month. So if you have a high load factor, it means that you're more or less using power constantly throughout the month at your peak load level. If you have a load factor, it means that you've got a peakier load where you're using more power in one particular hour, but a lower amount overall. And so when I first put this chart together, I was a little surprised to see the spike on the right-hand side of the graph. And I've highlighted this out, that you can see that just under 1% of customer months had load factors over 100%. And initially I was like, well, how do you have a load factor over 100%? Well, it's because I'm basing it on the peak demand. So what this means is that there's a small subset of customers who actually managed to reduce their peak demand to a level lower than the average amount they use in all other hours. So these are the customers who are responding strongly to the price signal and the demand charge. They might be doing this with a very aggressive setback in their HVAC use, or being absolutist about how they use energy during the peak period. The important thing to note, it is a tiny fraction of the customers on this rate are actively managing their demand in a way to get these very high load factors. I think I have in the text here something like 240 customers. 269 of the customers ever actually managed their demand in this way. That's the 0.8 number of customer months, and only 269 of the over 10,000 customers are actively managing the rate. The rest of them, as you can see, fit cleanly into this distribution. So what this tells me is that, contrary to the company's position, people on the demand rate are not managing their energy actively to increase their load factor. They simply are on the rate if it serves them and they're saving money because they have a high load factor. And as I tease out also on the prior page in number 11, having a high load factor is more a function of having high energy use. It is not actively managing your loads in order to produce that high load factor. The chart on the figure 3 there on page 11 shows the relationship between load factor and peak usage, and it shows that there's no appreciable difference in the amount of peak power that a customer uses and their load factor. And it shows that for both customers who have lower load factors and customers who have higher load factors, the ratio changes as it moves forward. And so the more energy that you use, the higher your load factor is. The higher your load factor is, the better suited you are to a demand rate. One does not need to manage their demand in order to be successful on a demand rate. One simply needs to be a large load customer, a high use residential customer who will be better served on this tariff. They don't have to actively manage their demand because we can see from the chart on page 12 that very few customers are doing that. So this goes again to the question of whether having a rate that incents high load factors is actually incenting behavior changes, or it simply is rewarding large, high-use residential customers because of the nature of their consumption. And my position here, and based on the company's data, it is doing the latter. There are very few customers who are actively managing their use to produce high load factors. Most of them simply have them because they use more energy than average.
And having, go ahead.
No, I think I have hit the points I wanted to on that. Please go ahead.
Okay, having redone your analysis from AriSEIA 22 to AriSEIA 24, does this change any of your recommendations, either within the exhibit or within your testimony overall?
No, it does not. Again, our primary focus of this case was designing solid time of use, volumetric time of use rates. We want that to be a tool that the company is able to use to help customers manage their own costs, but also to help put a downward pressure on the loads that are growing in the future so that those future cost request increases are lower than what they would otherwise be. I continue not to be a fan of demand rates for residential customers. I think as evidenced by the updated data, TEP's customers are being poorly done by this tariff. Fortunately, a lot of them who try it out realize it's a bad tariff for them and drop it very soon. But there are thousands of customers who stayed on it the entire rate at their detriment. And I would note the $600,000 is being collected from a handful of individual customers. I think I saw when I was looking at the ARAM proposal, the deadband that the company proposed, it valued the deadband, plus or minus at $6 million. And it said that $6 million was a significant incentive for them to manage their costs in a way. Right here, from these customers, a handful of thousands of residential customers who were on a bad rate for them, they collected $600,000. That's 1/10 of the entire bandwidth or deadband of the entire ARAM proposal. So that is a meaningful amount of money that is being collected from customers that does not need to be collected. It is a powerful incentive for the company to maintain this rate so that they can continue to overcollect from customers who don't have to be on this. So I would, again, recommend that the commission close this tariff to new customers, that the company be required to inform customers who are poorly masked for this so that they can change off that rate, because not everybody who has higher bills apparently knows about it. Some have stayed on this for the entire test year. So no, my recommendations and my testimony do not change.
And your analysis in AriSEIA 24 only pertains to one of the demand rates, but I believe that you recommended that the company be required to do a similar analysis for the other demand rate because you believe the results might be similar for those customers as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. I believe the other demand rate has a smaller number of customers. I don't have the number on the top of my head, but I think it may have been 2,000 or 3,000 as compared to 10,000 or 11,000. But the structure of the rate and the relationship it has to the customer usage patterns are going to be largely the same. So I would recommend that the company do an additional analysis on the demand, the residential demand the residential demand rate, and figure out if there is a large portion of those customers who are also being poorly served on it.
Do you think that the utility should be required to notify customers when they are not on their most economic plan?
I think that would be good consumer protection practice. These rates certainly do vary, and an individual's usage may vary over time. But the company already has a tool that is able to produce rates. It seems like it would be fairly straightforward for them to do that analysis on either a monthly or a quarterly basis to go back and scan a customer's usage, which they obviously have, and inform them if they're on a rate that is not well suited for them. again, there were so many thousands of customers that stayed on this rate for the entire test year, despite it being a bad tariff for them. I just think from a consumer protection standpoint, that's an easy fix for the company to make.
Do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I do not.
Your Honor, I'd move to admit AriSEIA 23, 24, and 25.
Any objections? Hearing none, AriSEIA 23, 24, and 25 are admitted.
And Your Honor, the witness is available for cross-examination.
We'll take cross from any interveners before we turn to RUCO and staff.
Your Honor, this is Kurt Bain with Kroger. I have a few questions.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Lucas. Good to see you again.
Likewise.
I just wanted to follow up. I realize we've been back and forth with you and Mr. Elliott a few times, so I'll try not to take too much time. But since you brought up the issue with the Mr. Barron's rate design proposal, I just have a few questions. In response to Ms. Johnson's questions, you testified that demand charges are perhaps, and then this is for the LGS, TOU, and LGS rate schedules. These questions are confined to those rate schedules. But you testified essentially that demand charges may not be justified because an individual customer's peak demand may not occur at the same time as the system peak. Was that your testimony?
No, it's not that they're not justified. It's that the assertion that Mr. Elliott made in his back and forth with you was that the company was under collecting demand charges because of how those rates were structured. So I'm not saying that they're not justified. What I'm saying is that statement embeds in it an assumption that the individual customer's peak demand coincides with the system peak demand. And to the extent that the individual customer's demand does not coincide with the system peak demand, then that individual customer's peak demand is not putting the cost pressure on the system that the rates are designed to collect. So my point was, one cannot say that the demand rates are being under-collected because one needs to analyze the actual, the degree to which those customers match the system peak. And in off-peak, the shoulder months and the winter months, there's a slight discount to the demand charge. I think it's maybe a 20% discount compared to the summer, but the company's system is not under stress in the spring and the fall compared to the summer.
Have you done any analysis and quantified what percentage of customers whose demands contribute to the coincident peak?
I have not done analysis in this case. I do have in my direct testimony, this is Exhibit 1, I believe, on page 8 and 9. So these are two charts. Bates page 14 and 15. These show TEP's monthly sales on Bates page 14, showing a substantial increase in sales in the summer months. And then on Bates page 15, it shows the hourly load profile for the summer and the winter for TEP as well as APS. And what you can see here is that the average load in the winter is roughly half of the peak load in the summer. So in terms of the coincidence of any customer's individual demand in non-summer months, it's going to be very low relative to the system peak coincident. In terms of individual customers, I have done an analysis in another case. It was focused on residential customers and not commercial customers. But what I found in that case is something on the order of 97% of individual customers had individual peaks that were at different times from the overall system peak on a monthly basis, which means that 97% of the time in any individual month, the customer peaked on a different time than the system peaked in that month. And fewer than 1% of customers peaked at the exact same time as the system peak. So that isn't a different utility and for a different group of customers. But just by the nature of use, it would not surprise me to find that individual customers have their own peaks at substantially different times than the overall system peak.
But TEP is not over collecting its total demand related cost from LGS and LGS TOU customers, correct?
I can't say that because it's going to depend on the actual billing determinants in that compared to what was embedded in the rates. So as I mentioned, if it's a particularly hot summer, or if more customers come online, it could be that the rates were designed at a certain level of assumptions for total billing demand of a customer class. And if those billing demands are higher, then the customer would collect additional money on that. That's one of the factors that can cause that.
That's not what TEP's cost of service study in this case shows, correct?
The cost of service study is looking backwards to a historic test year. So I'm talking about ongoing basis. What happens right now in 2026, and one can't know unless one were to actually compare every single month to find out what the collections were relative to what was embedded in assumptions.
So are you saying that the commission should set rates based on a cost of service study that's essentially impossible to do right now? What they're setting rates based on the cost of service study filed by TEP in this case, correct?
Correct, but your question was, are they over collecting or under collecting? And what I'm saying is one cannot determine whether they are over collecting or under collecting. That's a different question.
Well, and then I followed my next question was, that's not what the cost of service study in this case showed, correct? It's showing that they're not over collecting demand costs through demand charges. It's actually the opposite.
I'm trying to remember how the company makes adjustments in its rate. I know it's using a historic test year. It makes adjustments to the billing determinants in that test year and sets the rates in order to collect that revenue requirement. How that actually compares to 2026 and the actuals is currently unknown. I'm not proposing that the commission be unable to set rates. And I understand that Arizona uses a historic test year to set those rates. So to that extent, that is a fairly standard approach in utilities across the country. But that doesn't have any bearing on whether in 2026 right now, the company is under collecting or over collecting on those rates as they were designed against that test year.
You would agree that system peak is itself the aggregation of many individual customer demands, correct?
Yes, I would.
And diversity among customers reduces total capacity requirements, but it doesn't eliminate them, correct?
That's correct. Yes, that is correct.
So the utility can't ignore non-coincident customers and assume that they impose zero capacity costs, correct?
And I'm not proposing that they eliminate them. What I'm saying is, in the example, if a customer sets their individual billing demand on a date that is different from that, their contribution to the overall peak, which is where we're getting about their cost responsibility, may be different. And so it wouldn't be zero. It would be highly unusual for a 300 kilowatt customer to go down to zero. But if that customer was either practicing good demand response management, or they had an energy storage system, or they had some other way to anticipate when those peaks would be and reduce their usage appropriately, their contribution to the system peak would be lower than what their individual billing peak demand would otherwise indicate.
But we don't know who these customers are, right? There's going to be some customers within a class that are going to be sort of per your thesis are going to be we're going to be over collecting demand related costs from, and some that we're going to be under collecting demand related costs from. But we don't have any way, at least in this case, to identify who those customers are, correct?
I mean, in theory, the company has the billing data, so in theory, they could do an analysis to do that. Generally speaking, though, rates are set at a class average. You're correct. So the rates are set based on the class average, and individual usage patterns will determine, relatively speaking, if they are, under collecting or over collecting. My back and forth was in the example that was talked about, embedded in Mr. Elliott's answer, that demand charges are being under collected is an assumption that there is a coincidence between the individual customer's use and the system peak. And my position is that is not always the case.
You would agree that no utility rate design can perfectly trace every dollar of system cost to each individual customer on a moment-to-moment basis, correct?
Yes, I would agree.
And in rate making, the commission instead relies on reasonable cost causation proxies and allocation methodologies, correct?
It does, and some of those cost causation proxies are better than others. Again, I wasn't involved in the discussion on the cost of service side. I am more so in the APS case, and there is an active discussion there about the best way to reflect those costs relative to an individual customer's usage and the aggregate class usage. So those are active discussions that are being held in rate cases.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you.
Questions from other interveners before we turn to Ruco? All right.
Ruco has no questions for Mr. Lucas, Your Honor.
All right. Questions from staff?
Staff has no questions for Mr. Lucas, Your Honor.
Okay. Questions from the company?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, afternoon, Mr. Lucas, whatever it is where you are. I had a few questions for clarification. First, the data you requested was for the test year, correct?
Yes, I believe it was. That's correct.
All right. And I'm looking at Bates numbered page 008 on your exhibit 24. And in the second paragraph there, you indicate that the data set consisted of just over 10,000 customers with data for at least 1 month of the test year, correct?
Correct.
So there were a range of months that each customer had during the test year on which they were on the demand time of use. Is that correct?
Yes, some customers first showed up in January, some first showed up in February, and so on. Some customers that showed up first in January left in March and had no additional entries. Some stayed the entire time. Yes, there was a variation on that.
Okay. And then moving up to page 007, I think you indicated more than 2,100 customers in that data set remained on the demand rate for the entire year, correct?
Yes, those were the customers who first showed up in January and also had data through December.
Okay, so they had a full 12 months of data, those 2,100 customers, correct?
Yes, those customers had the full amount. That's right.
And so their bills covered winter, spring, summer, and fall, correct?
That's correct.
I did not see in your analysis an analysis of just those 2,100 customers. Did I miss it?
I think you did. I do talk about, let me find where it is. Yes, if you look at the top of Bates, page 12, of the 5,483 customers who were on the tariff for the entire year, 2,141 or 39% were on the wrong rate for them. These customers on average paid 10% or $13.40 per month more than they needed to on the RES TD rate compared to the RES T rate. The entire year, they paid an extra $161 per household, which totaled $344,000 in additional unnecessary revenue for the company from customers who did not, for whatever reason, make the rational choice to leave the rate earlier.
Okay, so that first sentence or second sentence there, it looks like now you're saying there's 5,400 customers who had 12 months of data. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
my apologies. The 2,141 are the subset of those customers who were on it for the entire year, who were not well served by this rate. The total amount, the 5,483, is the correct number of customers who were on the tariff for the entire year. Apologies for that.
Okay. And so 61% of them were on a rate that saved them money, correct?
They were on a rate that saved them money as a function of their usage patterns. That's correct.
And is it fair to say that the data that you had where you indicated fewer than half of the customers on that rate during the test year would not have saved money, that would have included customers that you noted who discovered the demand time of use rate was not a good choice in practice and chose to change rate plans?
It does, which I think is indicative of the fact that, a lot of customers signed up for this rate. It was poorly served, and they did make a choice to leave the rate. So they only have data for a handful of months, and in those handful of months, they lost money relative to the REST rate. Unfortunately, there was over 2,000 customers who did not make that choice to leave the rate, stuck on it for the entire year, and cost themselves hundreds of dollars in extra bills.
And your calculations of hundreds of dollars of bills, that's a total average. It's not broken out to median or anything like that. There may be a few customers who actually have a large overpayment that skews the average. Is that fair to say?
It's possible, but I think that would be mitigated by the nature of the customer who tends to save money on the REST rate. By and large, the REST rate is better for lower use customers. So their ability to have, they're not 2,500 kilowatt hour per month customers. They're 600 kilowatt hour per month customers. So just the magnitude of their bill is not going to be as large as the customers who are better served on the demand rate, which means that yes, it is an average, but it is probably not as affected by very, very high outliers that would skew that in one direction, but it is an average of those customers.
Okay, that's all I have, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Lucas, I just have one follow-up question. And at the start of your testimony, you commented on Mr. Elliott's response to a question, I believe for me, and a question that I had posed to you as well regarding whether we can make some of the changes that you proposed to the time of use rate in this case without impacting other rate classes or
Yes.
rate types within class. And you also testified a little bit about the ARAM. So, and if you can't answer this question, that's fine. I know you said you didn't delve deeply into the ARAM, but the ARAM's revenue allocation, or what's proposed to be the revenue allocation under ARAM adjustments, is different than the revenue allocation that's being proposed in this case, in that with the ARAM, it would be a more straight application of the cost of service study. So my question to you is, can we make the changes that you are proposing and still do a straight revenue allocation based on the cost of service study in ARAM adjustments and have that still make sense?
My default is that there's always a way. How easy or complex it may be. But as I understand the ARAM process, there's going to be a set of rules that are put together that are going to dictate how the costs are allocated. If one were to design a revenue neutral time of use rate, like I'm doing here, the standard process is that rate would go into effect. Customers would choose to go on that rate as they see. They would use energy in a certain way, and they would collect a certain amount of money. And at the end of when the next rate case comes up, an analysis would be done to see how those revenues stacked up against the comparison. So to the extent that there is a difference there, then those would get filtered back into the next rate setting mechanism. My understanding is the ARAM has something akin to that on an annual basis, where it's doing that true up. It's comparing it to different areas. So if one were to analyze usage for customers who changed onto the time of use rate as designed here, compare that revenue against the cost of service that would be allocated to the residential class, you could probably do a calculation of what they would have paid on the standard residential basic rate and what they did pay on the time of use rate, calculate some differential there, and then find a way to sort of squeeze that into the ARAM process. Once again, my understanding is there's a lot of moving parts in the ARAM, and that allocation of costs is largely intended to recover forward-looking capital costs that are not in the existing rates, that they're being implemented on an annual basis, so that the company doesn't have as large of a lag between when they incur an expense and when it's recovered. So the amount of money that we're talking about being recovered from a handful of thousands of customers currently on the time of use rate is probably relatively low to the hundreds of millions of dollars of investment that the company is making that is going to be the bulk of the cost allocation question. So yes, I would think that someone could design a process that could calculate and isolate those costs and structure them as some sort of a separate adjustment and flow it into the overall portion. But my suspicion is that the volumes that we talk about are going to be relatively low compared to the total dollar volumes that are being contemplated through the ARAM.
Okay, because the intent with the ARAM is not to do any updates to the cost of service study. So potentially the next new cost of service study would come in the company's next rate case, which could be as long as 7 years from now. Is that problematic if we were to adopt your proposal?
Well, I think again, and I think Ms. Johnson went through this with one of the witnesses, not having an opportunity to make changes to rate design in 7 years is itself a bit of an issue, particularly if some of our recommendations are not adopted here. But to the point of the cost of service study, there's a difference between cost of service and revenue recovery. Those are two different things. And just because a customer is on a rate that allows them to reduce the revenue, they may be reducing the revenue because they're lowering their cost of service. So I wouldn't say that the two things follow. It could be the case that these customers are adjusting their usage in a way that reduced the costs that is sort of commensurate with the reduction in the bills that they're getting on the rate. So in that instance, there wouldn't be any impact on the cost of service component. But even if a revenue class, even if a customer class has less revenue, that doesn't imply that the cost of service was wrong or different or needs to be changed. It just means that the utility earns less revenue. Those are two different things in my mind.
Okay. All right, Ms. Johnson, redirect.
I'd like to just follow up on that sort of last line of questioning there, Mr. Lucas. If the commission doesn't adopt any of your recommendations in this case, and they adopt the ARAM and we don't have another opportunity for rate design for 7 years, what does that mean as far as, one, the usage of the TOU rate for TEP and how it is or isn't benefiting the grid? And two, what does it mean for those customers that are on demand rates that are overpaying for the service that they're providing, that this may not be addressed again for, until the 2030s?
Yeah, I think both of those are problematic. I had a chart in my direct testimony that showed the relatively slow, I would say on an absolute basis, the slow adoption of time of use rates. And again, I know the company and I have some disagreements on this. I think they're an excellent tool for helping to manage that forward price signal to send to customers so that they modify behavior so these increases in the future are not as large as they would otherwise be. And right now, the rates are only being picked up at a fraction of a percent per year. So if no changes are made, my suspicion is that the next 7 years will look much like the last 7 years, which is very slow adoption by customers, and TEP leaving a tool on the sideline that it could otherwise use to get more robust demand reductions out of this customer group. And in terms of the demand rate, it would mean, again, customers, some customers may be trying it out for a short time and realizing it doesn't work and leaving. But unfortunately, some customers choosing the rate and for whatever reason not moving off it and costing themselves substantial amounts of additional unnecessary dollars. So I would say that in both of those instances, it would be a lost opportunity to make some changes that I think would both benefit customers and improve the customer protection, consumer protection aspect of it.
And even for those customers that do adopt the time of use rate, your analysis reflects that they only save approximately $7 a year. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think that was based on a 15% load shift, which is a pretty sizable load shift that would require, making conscious active decisions in your household to shift 15% out. If customers, were not as robust in their management, they would save even less. So the current time of use rate does not provide a strong price signal for customers to manage their demand on that rate.
After cross-examination, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. I think it again, it goes to the question of what is the function of prices and price signals. Yes, there's a component of rate design that is about revenue sufficiency for the utility, but there is a large component that individual customers would respond to the price signal and make changes on a go-forward basis. So the discussion that we've had about, should this be targeting only the energy component or should it be also targeting the capacity component? You want to have tools that can reduce and hold down the growth of the utilities rate base and expenses in the future. And time of use rates are a tool that can help do that, but only if they're well designed and only if they provide actionable, meaningful signals to customers in order to actually change their behavior going forward.
I have no additional questions, Your Honor.
All right, recross, Mr. Boehm?
No recross. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Mr. Patton, any recross?
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Lucas, for joining us again. Thank you for your time and your testimony, and we are all set with you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your flexibility and the many moving parts of my testimony. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. I think it would be wise to take a break before we move to staff's witnesses. So we will come back at 9:45, and we can go off the record.